We live in an era where you can track your macros, outsource your emails, and even delegate your small talk to AI. But there's no shortcut for someone knowing how you take your coffee without asking. Our obsession with optimizing everything might be sabotaging the one thing that matters most: genuine human connection. Today, we're exploring why intimacy refuses to be hacked, gamified, or automated, and the psychology behind our efficiency addiction, and what happens when we try to shortcut vulnerability. Because if we keep treating relationships like problems to be solved rather than experiences to be lived, we might optimize our way right out of love, friendship, and everything that makes us human.
So we're talking about how you can't hack intimacy.
Yes, that is correct.
That's kind of an interesting one.
It is, but it's something that everyone seems to be trying to do in today's day and age.
So attacking intimacy, like what do you mean just relationship intimacy?
Not attacking, hacking.
Hacking.
There's a big difference.
There's a big
between
difference,
attacking it and hacking it.
All right.
It's more about having an intimate conversation with someone or having an intimate relationship with somebody is, for a lot of people, uncomfortable, at least at first.
Right.
Requires a lot of vulnerability. And what we tend to see nowadays is that people try to hack it, meaning they try to get around the vulnerability or the uncomfortable aspect of it.
Right.
So they don't feel it. So today we're going to explore why intimacy can't be hacked, believe it or not, and what we risk when we try to do so.
All right, let's hear it. Okay, let's hear it. Yeah.
So have you ever tracked your macros before?
I've tried.
You have tried?
I mean, I guess I have. So what do you mean by so I did have some apps where I would follow, where I would track my protein,
Yep.
my carbs, that
Yeah.
kind of stuff, right?
Yep.
That's what you're talking about, just like the
Yeah.
number of carbs, not necessarily what you're eating, but the number of carbs, the number of proteins.
Yeah, you can do it a bunch of different ways. The app I use, for example, you can actually scan in your food and it'll tell you all the macro components. So proteins, carbs, sugar, if there's anything in there, that kind of thing. And so we can track our macros. We could even outsource our emails, whether it's to an AI assistant now or a virtual assistant or a in-person assistant, so that someone can respond on your behalf, for example, in an email. And you can, in some people, you can delegate small talk to artificial intelligence. Have you seen some of those news stories where AI is essentially replacing back and forth conversation?
Like for real?
Yeah, for real.
Like text messages.
Yeah.
And stuff.
Yep.
Really?
Yep.
Why would they?
There was one news story where a guy actually asked AI to marry him, and AI said yes, and he was very excited about it. So
Did they get married? Oh my god!
I just saw the headline. Yeah. Yep.
Wow.
So you can do all those hacks. We can hack our macros, even though we all know how to eat clean. But for some reason, hacking, looking at our macros helps us with it more.
Right.
We can outsource our emails, but there's really no shortcut for someone knowing how you take your coffee without asking. You can't.
Right.
Meaning you can't fake and you can't hack your way around somebody really getting to deeply know you. And I kind of compare it to, it's easy to pick on AI right now, right? Because it's the cutting edge of technology.
Right.
But you've mentioned before, like you can always kind of tell when somebody's used AI to write to you, right?
Mm-hmm.
You can always tell because you're missing that human connection piece
Right.
to it, and that's something that we're all, as human beings, we're capable of picking up on.
They always seems just slightly too well written.
Yeah, and it's just impersonal. There's no personality behind it.
Definitely lacks the personality.
There's no energy behind it.
Right.
Ed Milet talks a lot about the energy between people, and human beings, we can pick up on other people's energy, and that's really what you're tapping into with the AI piece. But you cannot hack your way around someone getting to know you on a really deep personal level. The world is flooded with dating apps too, right?
Right. Sure is.
And there's been a lot of them that have come and failed because they're trying, essentially what a dating app does, and not that they're bad, but what some of the dating apps have tried to do is go beyond just connecting people, and they've tried to essentially engineer that intense emotional connection that people have, and that's just something you just can't do.
Sure.
So a question I like to ask people is, have you ever tried to skip steps in a relationship? Because that's really when you're trying to hack intimacy, or when you're trying to get around the uncomfortable vulnerability that goes along with getting to know somebody.
Right.
You're really just trying to skip steps in a relationship. And when we try to skip steps in there, we feel like we're kind of missing something.
That wouldn't work.
Yeah. Right. So I want to talk a little bit about what I call the myth of optimization. Okay. Especially in relationships. And I'm not talking about, when you talk about intimate relationships, it's easy to think of primarily like
a romantic
relationship with a spouse or a boyfriend, girlfriend, what have you. But really, we have intimate connections with a lot of other people, just to varying degrees. Right. If you have a best friend, that's an intimate relationship. Your neighbor, there is some intimacy there. I know it sounds really strange, but if you have a next door neighbor that you've gotten to know a long time, that's a really deep personal connection if you know that person really well.
Right.
Same thing with extended family, grandparents, brothers, sisters, that kind of thing, your mom and dad. And so what the tech culture would say is that everything can be improved with this system, even if there's a connection.
Right.
Even connection can be improved with a system. And so we talk a lot about there's the rise of the efficiency mindset. We're always trying to optimize ourselves and to be as efficient as we possibly can. And so we talk about, let's time block our schedules to optimize the tasks that we're trying to do.
Have you tried to do that?
I have. I mean, I live by my schedule.
Yeah, that's true.
Have you?
I guess I have tried to do the time blocking, and and for a time it works, but then when you just have to get an appointment in somewhere where you blocked for deep work because you just there's always exceptions to be made. It just kind of ends up blowing it out the water. It's like I can't stay consistent with the time blocking just because other things pop up that I have to address. Yeah. So it's kind of like screw it. I'll just get my stuff done when I can. So I know that's not a good alternative, but
well, I think time blocking is really helpful for tasks, right?
Yeah.
But I would venture to guess that if we were to tell one of our spouses, hey, I'm going to time block our relationship so that way we have some dedicated time to work on it, I don't think it would be well received.
All right.
Not because we are trying to cheapen it, but we may really be trying to make more time for it. But when we try to throw our intimate relationships in the same category as our task list, you can kind of see how that whole premise starts to fall apart. And the reason for that is, what is the characteristic from your point of view? And I'm kind of setting you up without having given you any warning signs. If you think of your really deep relationships that you have,
right,
what causes your relationships to your deepest relationship? What causes it to be the closest, most personal relationship that you have? What's the one characteristic that tends to set it apart? I'm really putting you on the spot.
I feel like you're wanting to get a specific answer. I'd say that
I'll get you there. Don't worry.
I guess it's always on all the time.
Exactly.
With my relationship,
Bingo. Time
with my wife. Yeah,
time. It's the time you spent in it, right?
Right.
And we call that the time spent and the time invested, and we don't want to say time spent.
So I had the right answer,
honey. It's
nice.
time invested, right?
Right.
But we call that emotional labor.
Sure.
For to have a really deep relationship with somebody, you have to put in the emotional labor into the relationship. And so that's why in couples counseling, one of the biggest issues we run into is the couple comes in and one person will say, the common phrase is, I feel so much more invested in this relationship than he does, or I put so much more time into this than she has, and it's that perception of time. Is how much time have you invested in the relationship that really most of the time determines the depth of it. We all can have acquaintances, right?
Right.
And those relationships are fine, but they tend to be maybe an inch deep and a mile wide.
Right.
Whereas we want our closest relationships to be maybe an inch wide and a mile deep.
Right. Yeah.
right?
That's a good point. Good way to look at it.
And that only comes through the emotional labor. And the characteristic to have a deep relationship with someone, you have to put in the work, so to speak. That's why we all say marriage, for example, is work,
Right.
or any close relationship is work. But that emotional labor tends to be rather inefficient. There's no way to make it, to optimize it. There's no way to condense an hour of intense emotional labor in a relationship down to 20 minutes, right?
Right,
Because
sure.
time is time,
Right.
right? We measure time spent as the amount of time we spent.
Mm-hmm.
And so any attempts to optimize it tend to cheapen it. Does that make
Sure.
sense?
Yep, that makes sense.
So the emotional labor, while it seems inefficient when you're doing it because of the amount of time it takes, it's foundational to having an intimate connection with somebody, or the deep personal
Sure.
connection with someone.
Mm-hmm.
You follow me so far?
Yep.
So the problem then comes is when we replace our presence with performance. So we always have talked, the popular pop culture nowadays says work smarter, not harder, right? That's the
Right.
popular one. So
Mhm.
now we have AI, as we said, creating our task list and writing our emails and drafting newsletters and creating content. We're working smarter, but when we try to do that with our relationships, it never works, because what we're doing is we're replacing our presence in the relationship with the performance of it.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. Okay. It's not. It loses its realness, or its
exactly.
authentic.
Yeah, the authenticity.
Thank you.
Authenticity.
Right.
Yep. So we talk a lot, like emotional labor is foundational to having any intimate connection with somebody.
Mhm.
And as soon as you try to remove that component to it, we find that our efforts tend to fall apart.
Sure. Right. Right.
So the question then is, we try to optimize our interactions in relationships with things like, text messages, that kind of thing, which text messages aren't bad, instant messaging, what have you. But the question I always ask people is, are you more really, with all the technology and AI and so forth, are you really more emotionally available, or are you just more reachable? And there's a big difference between the two, right? There's a big difference between being able to instantaneously respond to a text message in the moment, rather than being able to actually connect with that person,
right,
on an ongoing
Interesting.
basis.
It's an interesting way to look at it.
So that's kind of the concern when we try to replace the emotional labor in a relationship with just being more efficient, being more optimized, if that makes sense.
Nothing worthwhile comes easy. Is that a good phrase?
Yeah. Nothing worthwhile comes without hard work.
There you
It's
go.
all kind of falling.
Okay, that's a little bit better.
It's all kind of falling apart. But really, to kind of keep focusing on our deep personal relationships, we have to remember that really our vulnerability and the amount of connection that we have with somebody can't really be outsourced. So really, the idea is that intimacy is built through mutual risk rather than the scripted responses that we have a temptation to provide.
Sure. Right.
Have you ever heard of the vulnerability loop?
No, I've heard of it. I think I've heard of it once or twice, but I don't really understand it.
So the vulnerability loop is really where the attempts to optimize relationships really falls apart. This is kind of where the rubber meets the road, and this is why when we try to, quote, optimize our relationships or our connections with others with technology and so forth, the vulnerability loop is essentially lost. And the vulnerability loop is like a theory. It's not a theory, but it's a concept of how do we build a deep emotional connection with somebody else. And really what the vulnerability loop says is that intimacy requires one person sharing authentically with somebody else. And the reason why that's vulnerable is because when you're sharing your authentic self, you're letting that other person see the entire you, both the good and the bad, right?
Right.
And it requires that person to accept it. And so the vulnerability loop includes the one person sharing authentically with the other person, and then the other person responding in kind. So you're putting the onus on the other person to see who you truly are as a person,
Right.
and then being able to respond authentically back in a way that affirms who you are as a person.
Right.
And
Interesting.
so that's called the vulnerability loop, and then it kind of goes back and forth, obviously.
Right.
So that's a lot different than what the tech world would say, which is AI therapy, for example. When you talk to the AI to resolve your emotional problems, right?
I tried that once just out of curiosity.
To see what it would do.
Just to see what it would do. And at first I was trying to be kind of like, I don't want to say, I was just asking it general questions about like, hey, how would you respond to somebody in this situation? And then, interesting enough, it did pick up that it thought that I was talking about something real.
Yeah.
And so then it changed, after a few prompts, it changed course. And it's like, hey, buddy, I'm here for you. If you need something, I'm here. I can give you advice. I can give you breathing techniques. I can give you what to say, which in theory, it sounds nice. It sounds great. Oh, hey, free therapy.
Yeah.
But there is no human element to that at all.
Yep.
And you're getting therapy from a computer, from an
algorithm,
from an algorithm.
Algorithm.
It's ridiculous.
Yeah.
And it's scary that if people are actually getting, sure, it's great to get some self-help stuff.
Yeah.
But to like actually use AI as like a therapy, like a licensed therapist, that's a recipe for disaster.
Well, it's even replacing AI. That what you're describing is using AI to replace human connection,
right?
And that's really at the heart of, if you're talking about therapy, the heart of therapy is the human connection.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason therapy works is not because of the technique that's used. It's not necessarily because they're using a specific approach for a specific problem. It's that the trust and the bond that forms between the therapist and the person receiving therapy, the person receiving therapy knows that regardless of what they bring to the therapist will accept them unconditionally and be authentic back to them. Obviously within reason, of course. They're expected to hold the line with boundaries and whatnot. But the point is, you can be vulnerable with a therapist. At least the premise is, you're vulnerable. You can be vulnerable with a therapist without fear of getting harmed by the therapist in return.
There's so much value in knowing that you can talk to somebody and be safe.
Yeah,
telling them anything.
Yeah,
because I would argue that there's probably a lot of the majority of people probably can't really, maybe don't even feel like they can get as deep or as personal as they want to, even with their spouse sometimes, or their significant other.
Well, because it requires risk.
Right.
The vulnerability requires risk, and I think,
like with therapy, you would have you have that human connection, but you don't have that risk of rejection.
Right. Exactly. And that really, to form intimate relationships, you have to be willing to take risks. I mean, there is some risk with a therapist, right?
Right.
Because you're projecting onto them, well, if I say what's really going on, what will they think? Will they still like me? That kind of thing. So there's always that element of risk that goes along with it. But once they dive into that risk and they realize that, this person still accepts me and still finds value with me as a person, that's when the real healing happens, because they feel genuinely heard and authentically accepted.
Sure.
But kind of connected to the intimacy that we have in our other lives, you've heard of like best first date questions. Like when you were dating your wife before you got married, obviously.
Right.
You probably saw best first date questions. What question should you ask someone on their first date?
I mean, it's been a long time since I looked at those, but yeah, I did.
But you kind of know what I'm talking
admit,
about, right?
I looked them up.
You know what I'm talking about, though. Those things aren't bad, but they kind of replace that idea of being vulnerable, because they kind of put mechanics into a conversation that should be spontaneous.
It becomes performative if you
correct.
do that.
Thank
and
you. Yep,
and because they're not genuine questions, even if you don't really know what to say.
Yeah.
I mean, if you like this person, and the person likes you, you say, hey, I don't really know what to say. I mean,
so things like,
and then they'll understand. They'll come up with their own topics too.
So things like having questions that you want to ask somebody on a date or whatever, those aren't bad at all, but it's not really being vulnerable. It's more like scaffolding, and scaffolding is this concept of building up towards having a connection with somebody, so to pick on the best first date questions, that you can see out there. If you just Google them, there's tons of them out there. They're not a bad thing, and they just kind of help build trust a little bit until then you can be authentically vulnerable with that person.
Yeah. Well, it could be considered as like a conversation starter.
Yeah.
I remember there was one time in college, there was this girl I liked, and I was going to take her on a date. I invited her on a date. And so we were just chatting it up on, at the time it was Facebook Messenger.
Oh, yeah.
Because that was the cool time to be on Facebook. We were talking, and all of a sudden I was like, hey, you know what? I don't want to talk anymore because I don't want to run out of things to say when we meet. And I actually sent that message, and she was like,
that's weird.
Okay. And needless to say, the date didn't happen. So like, okay, well,
struck out on that one, buddy.
And that was a good thing. That was a good thing I struck out.
But what were you trying to do? What were you trying to do and I'm not, again, you kind of teed this one up for me really well, but what were you trying to accomplish by cutting that off?
I had a fear of being face to face with somebody and not know what to say.
So you're trying to avoid the awkwardness.
I was trying to avoid the awkwardness.
Yep. And a lot of times what we do in our relationships is we have this temptation to avoid the awkwardness at the expense of being close to the other person.
Mm-hmm.
And how does that play out in our daily lives now? It means we may have a thought, we may have a concern, we may have a question about something, but maybe we don't bring it up to the person that we care about because we're not sure how they'll react, or we don't want them to react in a certain way that maybe invalidates us. But it's those kind of questions that we need to kind of dive into. We need to dive into that awkwardness in order to experience that closest with other people. And we find the more we avoid that awkwardness, so to speak, the more distance grows in our relationships. And that's a lot of times what we're doing when we try to outsource intimacy in these ways, is we avoid that awkwardness that comes with asking somebody a vulnerable question or checking in with somebody when something rubbed you the wrong way, for example.
It's avoiding the hard work.
Yeah, avoiding the hard work or the awkwardness. Yeah. So kind of an example, have you ever text messaged somebody and then just used the auto-suggested responses?
I've tried that before, but I've never used them because they're just not me.
So a funny experiment, and I'm not saying you should do this, but is to, in a text message with somebody that you trust and can laugh this off, is determine in a text message exchange to only use the auto responses, the auto suggested text, and just see how long it takes that person to pick up that something's weird. I did this with a good friend of mine who I mess with all the time, and I did that one day, and it went on for about 15 minutes, and then he essentially said, WTF, dude, what the hell is going on here? So my point is, it doesn't take long to pick up on that, right? And you can feel that the robotics of,
it doesn't have energy.
Yeah, there's no energy to it.
Right. Yeah.
So you compare that to kind of the halting, clumsy, but the emotionally honest talk that we would have with somebody if we have a struggle, or a conflict or a concern. And which one is better? On one side you have that the auto-suggested text exchange. That's a conversation, right? You're having a back and forth. Then there's no concern of saying something stupid or awkward or clumsy. And on the other hand, you have that uncomfortable, awkward, disjointed, but emotionally honest talk with somebody. And I think we both kind of know which one's more uncomfortable, but which one builds a deeper connection, right?
Right.
It's the latter, where you have that uncomfortable talk with a person or conversation.
Right.
The key to keep in mind when we're building intimate relationships or deep personal relationships with people is that intimacy begins the moment we stop performing. And that's why we would never, you talk about the dating world, I don't want to say never, but typically we don't decide to have a long-term relationship with somebody or marry somebody after the first date. Typically. Reality TV would say otherwise.
Right.
But typically we wouldn't do that. And why is that? Because it takes a long time to get past the performance stage. When you initially meet somebody, anybody, you're trying to put on your best face, put your best foot forward. You're trying to impress them,
Right.
right? In any context, you're always trying to impress the other person.
Right.
And so it takes a while for you to learn about the authentic person that you're with, and vice versa. And so intimacy is built that moment we stop performing in our relationships.
Oh, sure.
And that's that's a challenge that we're faced with when we try to, quote, hack our intimacy over time.
Sure, that makes sense.
So,
yeah.
Why do you suppose that we try to hack our intimacy?
Maybe because you want the benefit without the hard work?
I think we want the end. Yeah, you're close. I think we want the end result without having to, like you said, without having to go through the work. But I think really why we try to optimize.
And to protect ourselves too.
Yeah, exactly. There's the
protect
fear.
Ourselves from
right.
pain.
There's the fear. And that's why we try to circumnavigate the awkwardness of building a deep relationship.
Sure, right.
And the challenge with modern day living is that we're given all these tools with technology and whatever app you want to use to kind of fill in that gap so you don't have to feel awkward. But at the same time, we want the end result of having that deep personal connection.
Right.
But kind of the psychological drivers of why we do that is we have this fear of abandonment, we have this fear of shame, or we have this idea that we have to be perfect in order for somebody else to really accept us.
Right.
Technology tends to give us the illusion of control over the emotional chaos that is a relationship.
How so?
Because it gives us this idea that we can have a perfect response to any given situation.
Oh, sure.
Right?
Yep.
But the fact of the matter is, any deep connection that we have with somebody is going to be emotionally chaotic. And what do we mean by chaotic? Chaotic really means one day you can wake up and you can wake up on the wrong side of the bed, literally and figuratively, right? And the person that you're married to, for example, has to be able to tolerate the chaos that comes with you being an emotionally different person based on whatever stresses you're facing in that particular day, right? That's the emotional chaos that we're kind of referring to as an example.
Which is part of any relationship.
Exactly.
There's gonna be chaos. There's gonna be tension, and instead of running away from that, people need to understand that it's just part of it, and really to embrace it and work with it.
Vulnerability is really built in that messy middle where we both acknowledge that we're imperfect people.
Right.
We make imperfect decisions, but we're willing to go through this and do it together. Regardless of the relationship that you have. So, the challenge that we often have is as soon as a situation or a moment becomes uncomfortable, we tend to try to retreat from it.
Try to run away.
That's our tendency, right? Is because we don't want to be around something, or we don't want to be exposed to something that's uncomfortable. Why is that? Well, because when something is uncomfortable, there's an element of risk that goes along with it. When we're in an uncomfortable situation, the reason it's uncomfortable is because we're perceiving something in that particular situation could potentially cause harm or make us feel unsafe, upset, whatever term you want to use.
Sure.
And so our initial tendency is to try to avoid that. And what technology has done when we try to hack intimacy is it tries to completely remove any attempt of being uncomfortable. So if you have a relationship with somebody over text message, if you're uncomfortable with something, you can just ghost them, right?
Right.
You don't have. You can avoid an uncomfortable situation by just putting a screen between you.
Right, that makes
between
sense.
you and the other person. And so that's kind of the challenge. And so when we do that, what we're doing is we're shortcutting relationships. And there's no shortcut to having deep personal relationships. We had to stay in that messy, uncomfortable middle, if that makes sense.
Right.
So all that to say, after this long monologue, the key to keep in mind
You're just rolling. That's why I wasn't saying a whole lot. So
the deepest connections we have come from these slow iterative moments that we have to, I don't want to say tolerate, but we have to put ourselves through in order to develop that strong bond with other people. And again, this goes for any close relationships that we have, whether it's a romantic relationship, professional, or just a personal relationship with friends. The deepest connections come from slow iterative moments that we have.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, you have to be willing to spend time with them, spend time with the other person to really build that relationship.
Right.
And it's important to know that there's no app for showing up in person. Sorry, there's
Okay.
no app.
All right.
Whether it's Slack or Google Chat or iMessage, there's no replacement for real human interaction. And as I've always said, technology is a tool, but it's not a replacement. It
Right.
can complement our relationships, but it can't be
Right.
the main highway
Be
through
willing
which
to put
our relationships travel down.
Be willing to put the phones down.
Yep.
And take their friends out for lunch.
Yep.
Go for a walk.
So in closing,
You
the
know?
last thing, if you would receive in the mail a letter from two separate people that were important to you, and one of them was a page of a typewritten page, okay, from one letter, and the other letter you opened it up and it was a handwritten one pager. Which one would have more meaning?
Oh, handwritten page.
Handwritten,
100%, because it took time, took effort.
Right.
And there's no way that it could have been, well, I mean, it could have been an AI generated one. But, you know,
True,
I mean,
true.
they just you just write it out instead.
Well, true,
but
true.
but yeah, handwritten for sure.
Yep.
100%.
So the reason I bring that up is my closing thought is that intimacy is a language written by hand, and you can't automate the handwriting.
Enough said.
Enough said.
Enough said. That's a really good one, Josh.
Yep.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Non-Static Podcast. If you want to keep the conversation going and explore more ways to find peace, focus, and fulfillment, be sure to sign up for the Non-Static newsletter at nonstatic.org. We've got the link for you in the episode description. And if you or someone you care about is struggling with their mental health, we are here to help. You can connect with us anytime at Inspire Services at inspireservicesllc.com. If you found this episode helpful, take a moment to follow, rate, or leave a quick review. It helps more than you know, and it lets us keep bringing you the content you care about the most. Take care, keep moving forward, and as always, enjoy the journey.